So I decided to purchase my windows from vanwindowsdirect.com. This is not a sponsorship of any kind. The reason I wanted to buy my windows from them specifically and not Amazon is because they really had a lot of options for different windows. And I also wanted to support a local company in California. Since I'm located in San Diego, the shipping only took around 3 to 4 days, so that was great too. So just gonna go through my order summary real quick. The awesome thing about Van Windows Direct is they were super helpful in answering any questions that I had. There are a lot of different brands out there, but I decided to go with AMA because they're a little bit cheaper and also their warranty is a little bit better. So keep that in mind. As far as the molding, I needed 26 feet, but depending on how many windows you end up doing, I would just speak to them over the phone and ask them specifically how much you need. And the same goes for the urethane and the primer. I ended up actually running out of primer, so they were nice enough to send me an extra primer. They sent me the right amount of primer, but I actually ended up using a little bit more than I should have on the rear windows, so I ran out when it came to installing the sliding window. So when you're putting the primer around the windows, be careful you don't use too much and run out, because that's what I did. So use that primer sparingly so you have enough depending on how many windows you're doing. So my total for all the windows, urethane, primer, and molding came out to $1,153.72. Depending on what you're trying to accomplish with your van build, this may seem like a lot to spend on windows, but for me personally, I see it as an investment in my van. If I ever want to sell my van in the future, it'll be worth more. So with everything that I'm doing during this van build process, I want to make sure that I'm not cheapening out on materials and I'm spending the money on quality versus quantity. So just keep that in mind. I understand if you're on a budget and you want to buy them from Amazon and pay less on shipping, etc. But for me personally, I wanted to get my windows from a local company and do it this way. There's no right or wrong way to do it, so just do whatever works best for you. One thing right off the bat I want to recommend is if you have a friend or family member that can help you out, it really helps a ton just having an extra pair of eyes and hands to help you install these windows. It's not that you can't install windows yourself, but it will save you a lot of time and headaches. And also, it's just a little bit more reassurance that you're doing it correctly when you have another person giving their different perspective while you install your windows. Depending on the tools you have, you'll notice the first thing that I started doing was I used my drill bit with a metal bit, and I started drilling holes into the rear window. The nice thing about the Promaster is it has an exact cutout of where your window is going to fit, so you don't really need to do any measuring. The OEM window will fit perfectly if you just cut right along that edge that's created on the back on the interior side of the window. So the first thing I did was I drilled holes on the perimeter so that I could then cut from the outside of my van with the jigsaw. Some people like to use a grinder. I've noticed on other videos I didn't have a grinder, so I used a drill bit to create the initial holes. So we drilled holes around the perimeter, and now my mom's just taping the perimeter of the window so that when I use the jigsaw from the outside, I'm not scuffing up the paint on the outside of these doors. Really, the only reason for taping for the rear windows is if you decide to cut using the jigsaw from the outside of the van versus going from the interior side, which has a uneven surface, which makes it a little bit more difficult to cut using the jigsaw. So that's why we decided to go from the outside, which therefore then we have to tape the perimeter, make sure that we don't scuff up the paint.
That's not good.
I didn't realize it at the time, but I was using the wrong jigsaw blade. I was lucky enough that my neighbor came over to save the day, and he ended up letting me use one of his jigsaw blades, which was a fine tooth. It made my life so much easier when it came to cutting out the windows. I wish I knew that from the beginning, but you know, hindsight 2020, what can you do? This is the main reason why I wanted to create this video and give you guys as much detail as possible, because these are things that I didn't know initially when I started doing this. So don't use a standard jigsaw blade. Otherwise, you will break your jigsaw like you just saw. Lucky enough, I was able to fix my jigsaw and I was able to get right back to work. If you didn't make the cuts accurately or your edges are really rough, it's going to be harder to put the molding on. So if your molding isn't fitting nice and snug, then you know you got a problem and you might have to go back and maybe refile it a little bit more, or potentially even cut the windows more accurately and hammer it in nice and tight. Just don't over hammer it because you might cut the molding. The next step is adding primer, but before you do that, I would highly recommend taping off any areas that you don't want primer and urethane to get at, because once you start this process, it's very difficult to go back and then tape it, because this stuff is pretty messy and it dries quickly, so you won't have much time to do that. And like I said earlier, use the primer sparingly. Don't use as much primer as you see me using, because you will run out of primer if you do that. And also, if you come back later to maybe do the third window the next day, make sure you keep that primer sealed up, because it will dry very quickly and you won't be able to use it the next day if it's all dried up, which is what happened to me. So just want to go over all those details so that you don't make the same mistake as I did. So the next step is applying the urethane. I would definitely recommend getting an electric caulking gun just to make your life a lot easier. I was using a regular one and it killed my hand. I have a pretty high pain threshold and I was able to do all the windows just fine with a regular caulking gun, but if I were to go back and do it again, I would definitely recommend getting yourself an electric gun for around like $50. I noticed online some people were spreading the urethane about a half an inch along the border of the window. So I went along and did that, and then putting a little bit on the van itself and the window seemed to work out really well. Any additional urethane that I had left over, I put in the corners. It's kind of like a school art project. You probably can't go wrong with using a little bit more urethane versus less. But once you stick it on there, it's really difficult to get this thing off and move it around. So before you apply the window, I would really make sure you have an adequate amount of urethane on the van itself or the window. At the end of the day, you want it to stick. Like I said earlier, urethane is super messy. Don't worry if you have some smudges around the edges. You'll be able to clean that up quickly afterwards with some acetone. Just be sure not to let the urethane dry too long, because after a few hours, it's like cement. So even with the acetone, it'll be extremely difficult to get this stuff off. And personally, I ran into this problem and the next morning I was scrubbing for hours. So to avoid this, clean the smudges of urethane right away with acetone, and then tape your van window and make sure it's secure and let it dry. And you don't have to do this, but my mom and I decided to add a little extra urethane at the very top to just make sure the windows were super watertight and prevent any water or rain from coming in. So at this point, you should have a pretty good understanding of how to install the windows. I've seen online that a lot of people are purchasing the C.R. Lawrence brand OEM style window with the vent, which I think is around $600 something or so. To be honest, when I was looking into that window, I didn't really love the fact that the bottom opened up slightly to create that ventilation. For it being that expensive, I felt like I wanted a window that opened up a lot more. I was really stoked when I found that half slider window on Van Windows Direct, and the fact that this one opens up halfway is awesome because you get tons of ventilation, plenty of sunlight, and it still looks like a professional window, and it's still really stealth. So we're doing the half sliding window today. My mom and I learned from our mistakes yesterday, and we learned that you need to tape better. So that's what we're doing. We're taping our perimeter right now, so when I use the jigsaw, it's more precise. And also when we add the urethane on later, the tape is gonna block a lot of that urethane because it's extremely difficult to take off the urethane once you've already applied it. So learn from your mistakes and do a better job. Also, it's hotter than Haiti out here, and I'm wearing a long sleeve because when I start cutting with the jigsaw, sparks flying everywhere, metal flying into your face, so I wear a mask, goggles, and a long sleeve because the other day I was getting shards of metal into my hands. So, also in my legs. It goes everywhere. I'd rather be hot than injured. Right now, my mom is adding a perimeter with Expo marker. It's a little overkill, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Then we cut.